Pero justamente con base en eso y con base en tu experiencia ya de un tiempo aquí en Colombia, hay personas que, tanto en Colombia como vamos a ver en Brasil, dicen que esa es una situación típica de Estados Unidos, que eso no pasa en Colombia o eso no pasa en Brasil o eso no pasa en otras partes, y que tratar de hacer aquello que tú estás describiendo como una vivencia, es decir, programas de acción afirmativa, es importar una categoría y sobre todo un conflicto racial que aquí no existe. Tú, comparando los dos contextos, obviamente conoces menos el colombiano que el estadounidense, pero suficiente como para reaccionar. ¿Qué piensas de eso?
I've had this conversation with some colleagues in Cartagena, and one of my responses to one of the professors I was talking to in Cartagena about the fact that there is neither race nor racism in Colombia. There are neither black people nor white people in Colombia. And she asked me, where are the white people in Colombia? And I said, open to the social pages in the newspaper in Cartagena. And the social pages, of course, report all of the fanciest parties and the birthday parties of all the debutantes. And you open the social pages, and everyone there is of very light skin color. I don't know if you all say white, but to my US eyes, the people on the social pages are white. And this is in a city that is, what, 30 to 50% of African descent. So there clearly is social stratification, social division, that leads to the fact that the newspaper in that city has the fancy parties in the rich neighborhoods where all of the faces are white. So I'm not convinced, but there's no question that things are different here. But that's just one piece of evidence that I've observed as an outsider about the ways in which there are similar kinds of social segregation, perhaps not racial segregation, although there are reports in Cartagena that show the similar kinds of racial segregation in terms of residential segregation. But there clearly is evidence in my reading of that kind of social segregation.
One thing to add to that is that the category of white has its own history in the United States, so that the groups that are considered to be white now had their own histories of local forms of discrimination and worse. And it's an interesting set of dynamics, the extent to which groups that had family histories, whether discrimination against Southeastern Europeans or Jews or otherwise, that wouldn't have been seen as in a position of privilege. Today, some members of those groups are then hostile to affirmative action because they feel they've made it. Others of them look at their own family histories and see that there was a category of privilege from which they were excluded and ally themselves against categories of privilege. So there's a sort of set of dynamics in which the category white has different populations over time. And I think perhaps being clearer about the fact that it is a category of status that can be filled by different groups is helpful in thinking about how it might have specific local meanings.
Una pregunta para Reva en la dirección de la práctica jurídica en Estados Unidos. En América Latina, en varios países de América Latina, incluyendo Brasil, Colombia, los otros aquí presentes, se han intentado, incluso en el observatorio hemos intentado casos, litigios por discriminación racial. Por ejemplo, en la entrada de discotecas. Ahora va a moderar el panel una persona que litigó personalmente en Cartagena uno de estos casos, pero el problema que se encuentra normalmente es probar. Obviamente el punto de la prueba es difícil. Sabemos por tu trabajo que en Estados Unidos se ha utilizado una doctrina justamente para tratar de evitar el problema de la prueba, es decir, tratar de probar que una persona deliberadamente discriminó a otra por motivos raciales. Para evitar ese problema se ha utilizado una doctrina que se llama de impacto desigual, disparate impact. ¿Nos podrías contar un poco más sobre cómo ha funcionado eso y cuál ha sido la evolución de esa figura que puede ser útil para este contexto latinoamericano?
So when we say that practices discriminate, we could mean a lot of different things. We could just mean that they expressly reserve jobs or school positions for persons by specific racial groups. And indeed, some systems of racial privilege operate in just that way. And certainly we had that order of things in the United States. But we ended that order of racial privilege and began some other one in the 1950s to 1960s. At that point, US law said you can't put names on positions and reserve them by race. And so there began a long debate about how you could prove discrimination when institutions that used to reserve positions expressly by race continued to be dominated by members of majority groups. There are different ways to go about showing bias, and one of them is to prove that the decision maker purposefully set out to reserve the positions only to members of majority groups. That's hard to show. You need to get evidence, and the evidence for proving, assuming that the burden of showing this is on the challenger from outside the institution, it's not going to be easy to show that. And people are in a position to object and to point to other reasons for their action. A second way of challenging the situation is to challenge to allege, or to argue not simply that the decision maker intended to reserve the positions all for majority group members, but rather that he or she used decision rules that systematically and predictably were going to privilege members of certain groups and that have a disparate impact on members of historically excluded groups. That's called disparate impact liability. And we have this framework in our federal employment discrimination law and in other of our statutes. When you have a disparate impact framework, the burden on the challenging party is to show simply that the decision criteria that the institution used statistically were likely to choose one group more than another. At that point, the challenger doesn't win, but rather shifts the burden to the institution to justify its selection criteria, to show that there were institutional reasons why the school or the employer chose neutral criteria with a racial disparate impact. And it's up to the decision maker then to decide whether that amounts to a weighty reason. In the US, the framework of proof actually, in the end, allows the challenging parties to come back and say, even if you have some reason for using the criteria that you're using, there's some other way to go about it that would have less of an exclusionary impact. And if they can show that, they win.